Most clubs have a process for onboarding their new members, but do they also have a program they follow when welcoming new volunteers? Whether they're Sertomans serving on a committee for a first time, or someone from your community volunteering at an event or fundraiser, it's important to prepare them for what their role will entail and how their help is important to your club meeting its mission. This is volunteer onboarding. Volunteer onboarding is exactly what it sounds like, the process of orienting an individual serving in a volunteer capacity with your organization. A strong volunteer onboarding program will hit on several key points. It goes beyond simply talking about the club, Sertoma, or the event. It delves into the knowledge and skills that everyone will need to be successful. It helps each person understand the various roles involved in the task at hand and how they'll all work together as part of the organization's overall culture. Onboarding also gives your volunteers the perfect opportunity to build relationships with each other and the leaders who will be there to guide them. So why do you need one? Nonprofit technology platform Wild Apricot has identified 7 reasons volunteer onboarding is critical to a nonprofit's success. The first and perhaps most obvious one is the sense of belonging that comes with being a volunteer. Feeling like we're part of the greater good is the reason that many of us become Sertomans in the first place. Wanting to fit in is also fundamental to the human condition. Wild Apricot explains that volunteers who feel like they belong to a group of people working towards a common goal find more meaning in their work. When we have meaning in our service, we are much more likely to be active participants who are ready to meet challenges and fulfill our responsibilities. When we complete proper onboarding, we begin our role as a volunteer already feeling engaged with the club and its mission. Volunteer onboarding is incredibly important to building a strong club culture. How many of us have signed up to volunteer only to show up to disorganized chaos and no one understanding what's going on? This frustrating experience prevents many from wanting to volunteer again and can even lead to an event's failure. On the other hand, when the club focuses on creating a community within the club and its volunteers, the experience will be so much enjoyable for everyone involved. Getting everyone on the same page during onboarding opens the door to stronger collaboration and long-term friendships amongst those serving. It also builds an environment where accountability is front and center, as we are less likely to feel at ease letting their team down. While we just touched on the connections that are built amongst peers, it's also important to remember that club culture includes the relationships between volunteers and leaders. Onboarding can help volunteers understand how they should engage when they're facing an issue, question, or even feel like they're in the wrong role. The truth is that not every volunteer is going to be a match for every opportunity. That's okay. Your club should have an environment where volunteers feel comfortable speaking up, and that begins at orientation. Another plus to onboarding is that it puts leaders and volunteers together in a more casual environment. It gives them a chance to interact before the work is begun, which can help to build a sense of comfort and trust for the volunteer. Wild Apricot reminds us that it's important that leaders clearly explain that they are available to help, and the volunteers can come to them with questions and concerns. Volunteer onboarding is the time where we can set expectations, both for the volunteer and for the club. The volunteer needs to know what is expected of them and what they can expect in return. The organization needs to explain what it wants in its volunteers and how it will be there to support them in their efforts. It's about striking a balance so that both sides walk away from the experience feeling successful and satisfied. It can be especially helpful to have a conversation about personal and organizational goals as a group. Volunteer onboarding can serve as a pep rally of sorts, starting with an energetic kickoff for the work that lies ahead. It helps us to understand our mutual goals, the people that we're helping, and how our assistant contributes to the overall picture. That's what makes volunteers passionate, after all. Wild Apricot suggests that leaders demonstrate motivation in 3 ways. First, autonomy. Help volunteers understand how they will be able to self-direct tasks and teams. Second, mastery. Help volunteers find the right tasks that meet their abilities and interests so that they can learn, progress, and hopefully master their goals. And third, purpose. Help volunteers recognize their sense of a higher purpose that lies beyond their own interests. Acclimation is one of the things I personally appreciate most about onboarding. Going through the orientation process helps me feel comfortable in my environment and with my team. We're all different, and we need different things in order to be prepared. Your goal as a leader is to try to implement as many of those tools as you can. This may include a volunteer handbook, schedule, a descriptive list of volunteer roles and tasks, contact information, and more. It can also include more subjective tools like building an environment centered upon trust, ensuring that volunteers will get the support they need when they're feeling challenged or unsure. And finally, last but not least, we have volunteer retention. Volunteer onboarding is important to keeping volunteers engaged year after year. When someone has a positive experience, they're more willing to come back and more willing to bring their friends with them. When they don't, you'll likely never see them again. So make sure to use volunteer onboarding as a way to keep your volunteers and members engaged for years to come. So now that we understand what volunteer onboarding is and why it's so important, it's time to examine what the process might look like. In this case, we have 5 suggested phases. Review the current state of things, organize the team, orientate and train, manage your volunteer team, and keep the feedback loop open. When establishing any kind of strategic plan or program, the first step is always to look at what's currently in place. There are several questions you can ask to get a clearer picture of where your program stands and what you can do to improve the volunteer experience. I would suggest not only discussing this with the team, but also to anonymously survey your past volunteers or members to get their honest feedback. Questions to ask could include, what's working and what's not? What are some common questions we get from our volunteers? What is our volunteer retention rate? How many come back to volunteer again? Who are our volunteers? What does our training look like? What else do we need to be successful? And what do our volunteers think of their experience with us? Next up, you'll need to organize your team. This starts with identifying those who will lead and train the club's volunteers. As Wild Apricot says, these individuals should be passionate about your mission and have experience with your club and activities. The best leaders are ones who've been through it before. Leaders need to be champions for your cause and for your volunteers. They're tasked with helping volunteers feel ready and capable. With proper communication and training, our leaders empower our volunteers to become leaders in their own right. Once you have your volunteer leadership team in place, it's time to start onboarding your volunteers. At the heart of this is orientation and training. This is where they'll learn what the volunteer opportunity is all about, how it fits into the club's mission and vision, role expectations, any safety concern or legal rules, and more. It's important to have this information gathered into a single document that can be printed and handed out, emailed, or accessed online. Training does not have to be done in person, though certainly many people will prefer it as it's typically more personal. It gives us the opportunity to interact one-on-one and as a group in a more interpersonal way. However, virtual sessions held in real time can be another great way to engage your volunteers. This is especially true during times like the pandemic or bad weather where meeting in person can be impossible, when you're trying to balance a myriad of schedules or when your volunteers are spread out in different places. It can also happen more quickly when an immediate need arises and does not have the same audience size limitations that some in-person meetings can have. And finally, you can offer your volunteer onboarding as an on-demand session. This allows volunteers to access the orientation materials when it's convenient for them. They can also learn at their own pace, rewinding to make notes or when they might have not heard something the first time. On-demand orientation also gives you an option for those volunteers who might come in a little later than everyone else. Just make sure that if you offer on-demand orientations, the volunteers understand how they can easily reach you with questions or comments. After you've trained your volunteers, you need to trust them to do the work and let them loose. Let them do their jobs. Be available to them without micromanaging. We know that can be hard, especially when you've been involved for years, but it's important to let our volunteers make the experience their own. Some ways you can effectively work with and thus manage your team include communication, recognition, and appreciation. With communication, you're focused on keeping your entire team informed. It's a great way to remind them of upcoming meetings or deadlines, share updates about progress, and commemorate achievements. Recognition allows us to formally and informally celebrate individuals and teams for a job well done, or sometimes a job done at all. And obviously, appreciation demonstrates our gratitude for the help of all those who are involved in making our events successful or serving our community. Consistency and creativity are your best friends when finding ways to thank your team. Your final step is really more of a reminder than anything and relates directly to our very first step. Keep the feedback loop open. Continue to survey your volunteers regularly. Have frequent discussions of your club's overall volunteer program. Give updates at club meetings, on social media, and in newsletters. Make it impossible for members to say that they don't have an opportunity to be heard or that they were unaware of what was going on. In short, be as transparent as you can, as open as you can, and as available as you can. And that does it for our session on volunteer onboarding. It's like Wild Apricot said, with effective onboarding, you can inspire deeper participation and commitment among your amazing team of volunteers and help your organization thrive. We hope that the guidance provided in today's training will help you in your pursuit of volunteer development. Don't forget that Sertoma is always here to help you. You can find additional resources on this and other topics in the Sertoma Member Center at sertoma.org. You can also connect with other members as well as your headquarters staff when you join our Facebook group at the link on the screen.